The glass door of Sweet Heaven Bakery shattered the moment Kang, Dae-hyun's bodyguard, pushed it open too hard. The sound cut through the small shop like a gunshot, and every head turned toward the entrance. Dae-hyun stepped inside, his $1,000 shoes crunching over broken glass, his face carved from stone. He was here for one reason: to order a wedding cake that would cement his position as the most powerful Korean mafia boss in Atlanta. The marriage was strategic, cold, necessary. His bride-to-be was the daughter of a rival syndicate leader, and this union would end a bloody war that had claimed too many lives and cost too much money. The wedding was in 3 weeks, and every detail had to be perfect. This cake would be photographed, admired, and talked about in every corner of the criminal underworld. It was a symbol of power, of alliance, of his complete dominance over the city's underground empire. But the moment his eyes landed on the woman behind the counter, everything stopped. Time folded in on itself. His heart, which he thought had turned to ice years ago, cracked wide open. She stood there, thinner than he remembered, her face drawn with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless struggles. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple apron covered in flour. And in her arms, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, was a little girl. The child couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with wide brown eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a face that looked exactly like his own mother's face in the old photographs he kept locked away. Dae-hyun felt the floor tilt beneath him, felt his carefully constructed world begin to crack at the foundations. If you want to know how a man who built an empire on violence and fear can be brought to his knees by a single glance, keep watching. This story will break you before it heals you. His ex-wife, Jade, froze when she saw him. The color drained from her face so fast he thought she might faint right there behind the counter. Her grip on the little girl tightened instinctively, protectively, like a mother animal sensing a predator. The little girl looked up at her mother, sensing the sudden tension in the air, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and she buried her face in Jade's shoulder. Dae-hyun's mind raced, doing the math, counting back the years with the precision that had made him a fortune in illegal arms, deals, and territory acquisitions. 4 years. It had been exactly 4 years since he'd driven Jade out of his life, since he'd sat her down in his penthouse office and told her in the coldest voice he could manage that she was a distraction, a weakness he couldn't afford. He'd been clawing his way to the top of the underworld then, fighting 3 different syndicates for control of Atlanta's port access, and every day had been a battle for survival. She'd cried, begged him to reconsider, told him they could make it work, but he'd been stone-faced, unmoved, convinced that cutting her loose was the only way to keep her alive. His enemies had already started asking questions about her, and he couldn't risk it. He'd convinced himself it was for her own good, that she'd be safer away from him, away from the violence that followed him like a shadow. He'd even had his men watch over her from a distance for the first few months, making sure she got home safe, making sure no one from his world touched her. But now, staring at this child who had his eyes, his cheekbones, his stubborn jawline, the same small birthmark on her left temple that he had, he realized the truth with devastating clarity. He hadn't protected her. He'd destroyed her. And worse, he'd destroyed something he didn't even know existed. The little girl peeked out from Jade's shoulder, and when her eyes met his, Dae-hyun felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, not the fear of bullets or betrayal, not the fear of losing territory or money or respect, but the fear of facing what he'd done. The fear of being too late to fix something that might be permanently broken. The child had his mother's gentle eyes, but there was something else there too, something that reminded him of himself as a boy. A whole wariness, a guardedness that no 4-year-old should have. She studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see right through his expensive suit and cold exterior to the man underneath. Behind him, his bodyguards stood silent and alert, their hands near their weapons, ready for any threat. The other customers in the bakery had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what. An elderly woman clutching a box of cupcakes hurried toward the exit, not wanting to be caught in whatever was about to unfold. A teenage employee behind the counter looked between Jade and Dae-hyun, confused and frightened. The smell of fresh bread and sugar hung in the air, incongruous with the tension that had filled the small space. Dae-hyun had walked into war rooms, had stared down men, twice his size, who wanted him dead, had negotiated deals worth millions with a gun pressed to his spine. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him for the possibility that he might be a father. "Can I help you?" Jade's voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath, could see the way her pulse jumped in her throat. She was trying to stay professional, trying to pretend she didn't know him, trying to protect whatever life she built in the years since he'd thrown her away. But her hands were shaking as she set the little girl down behind the counter, out of sight, whispering something to her that Dae-hyun couldn't hear. The child disappeared into a back room, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and Jade straightened up, squaring her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. Dae-hyun's bodyguard, a man named Tae-min who'd been with him for 8 years, stepped forward, ready to speak, ready to handle this transaction like he handled everything else in Dae-hyun's life. But Dae-hyun held up a hand to silence him. This moment required no intermediary. This moment was his alone to navigate, his alone to survive or be destroyed by. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could find the words, the back door of the bakery burst open, and 3 men in black suits entered, guns drawn. They weren't his men. Dae-hyun's hand went to his weapon automatically, his bodyguards moving into defensive positions, but then he saw the look on Jade's face. Cold terror, the kind that told him these men weren't here for him. They were here for her. And suddenly, this wedding cake, this alliance, this entire empire he built meant nothing. Because the mother of his child was in danger, and every instinct he tried to bury roared back to life. The gunmen didn't waste time with introductions. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, pointed his weapon directly at Jade and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of finality. "You're 3 months behind, Jade. Mr. Vincent doesn't like waiting, and he especially doesn't like being ignored. You know what happens to people who owe him money and think they can just hide behind a bakery counter." Dae-hyun's entire body went rigid. Vincent. He knew that name. Gerald Vincent ran a loan sharking operation on the south side, the kind of predatory business that targeted desperate people and bled them dry. It was small time compared to Dae-hyun's empire, barely worth his attention, but Vincent had a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. The man collected debts with brass knuckles and blow touches, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. Dae-hyun felt rage building in his chest, hot and violent, the kind of anger that had made him legendary in the underworld. How much did she owe? How long had this been going on? And why hadn't his network picked up on this? He had people everywhere, eyes and ears in every corner of Atlanta. Yet, somehow, his own ex-wife had been suffering under a loan shark's thumb, and he'd known nothing about it. The scarred man took a step closer to the counter, his gun never wavering. "We're taking the bakery today. You've got 30 minutes to clear out your personal things. After that, everything here belongs to Mr. Vincent. And if you try to run, if you try to hide that little girl somewhere, we'll find you both. You know we will." Jadi's face had gone pale, but she stood her ground, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles had turned white. "I told him I'd have the money by the end of the month. I've been making payments. I just needed a little more time. Business has been slow, but it's picking up. I can pay him back. I just need out." The scarred man cut her off with a harsh laugh that made Dae-hyun's blood boil. "Time? You've had time. 4 months of time. Mr. Vincent's done being patient. Now he wants his investment back. With interest. You borrowed $50,000 to open this place, and with fees and penalties, you now owe him $200,000. So either you've got $200,000 hidden in your flour sacks, or you're walking out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. 200,000. The number hit Dae-hyun like a physical blow. He spent more than that on a single dinner with associates. Had watches in his collection worth 3 times that amount. And here was Jade, the woman he'd once loved more than his own life, the mother of his child, being threatened over money that meant nothing to him. He could feel Taemin and his other bodyguards waiting for his signal, ready to turn this bakery into a war zone if he gave the word. But there was the child to consider. His daughter, because he knew now with absolute certainty that she was his, was somewhere in the back room, probably terrified, probably listening to every word. One wrong move and she could be caught in the crossfire. Dae-hyun stepped forward, placing himself between Jade and the gunmen. His movement was deliberate, controlled, radiating the kind of authority that had made men twice his age bow to him. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice quiet but carrying enough menace to make the scarred man's eyes narrow. "And neither is this bakery. Whatever debt she owes, it's paid. I'm buying it out, right now." The scarred man's gaze traveled over Dae-hyun's expensive suit, his custom shoes, the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist that cost more than most people made in a year. Recognition flickered across his face. He clearly knew who Dae-hyun was, or at least knew enough to be concerned. But Vincent's orders were probably absolute, and backing down would mean facing consequences of his own. "Mr. Vincent doesn't negotiate," the scarred man said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "He wants what he's owed, and he wants this property. You can't just walk in here and..." How Dae-hyun pulled out his phone with one hand, while his other hand rested casually on the gun at his hip. "Call him, now. Tell Gerald Vincent that Kang Dae-hyun is offering him $300,000 to walk away from this debt and never contact this woman again. If he's smart, he'll take the deal. If he's not, then he and I will have a very different kind of conversation, and I promise he won't like how it ends." The room fell silent except for the sound of the scarred man's heavy breathing. Behind the counter, Jade was staring at Dae-hyun like she'd never seen him before, her eyes wide with shock and something else, maybe hope, maybe fear, maybe both. The scarred man pulled out his own phone, stepping back toward the door while keeping his gun trained on the room. His conversation with Vincent was brief, muffled, punctuated by long silences that stretched out like pulled wire. Dae-hyun didn't move, didn't blink, his entire focus on protecting Jade and the child he'd only just discovered. When the call ended, the scarred man looked frustrated and angry, but he lowered his weapon. Mr. Vincent accepts your offer. He wants the money wired within the hour, and he wants confirmation that you understand this makes the woman your problem now. Anything she does, any trouble she causes, it's on you. Dae-hyun nodded once, already pulling up his banking app. It'll be in his account in 10 minutes. Now get. The three big men backed toward the door, clearly unhappy but not stupid enough to argue with someone of Dae-hyun's reputation. As they left, the scarred man paused in the doorway, looking back at Jade with something like pity. You have no idea what you just got yourself into, lady. You think you had problems before? Just wait. Then they were gone, the broken glass crunching under their feet as they disappeared into the Atlanta afternoon. The bakery fell silent. Dae-hyun turned to face Jade, and for the first time in 4 years, they were alone together. Well, almost alone. From the back room, he could hear the soft sound of a child crying. Jade moved first, rushing toward the back room, but Dae-hyun caught her arm. Wait, he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. Is she mine? It was the question that had been burning in his chest from the moment he'd seen the little girl's face. Jade's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Her name is Naomi, she said quietly. She's 4 years old, and yes, Dae-hyun, she's yours. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you threw me out of your life. I tried to tell you. I called, I came to your office building. I left messages with your people. But you'd made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with me. And your security team made sure I got the message. So I did what I had to do. I took out a loan, opened this bakery, and I raised our daughter alone. The words hit him like bullets, each one finding its mark, each one drawing blood. He'd been so focused on building his empire, so convinced that cutting her out was the right thing to do, that he'd missed everything. He'd missed the pregnancy, missed the birth, missed 4 years of his daughter's life. And in trying to protect Jade, he'd left her vulnerable to predators like Vincent. I need to see her, Dae-hyun said, and he hated how his voice shook. But before Jade could respond, Taemin's phone buzzed with an incoming message. The bodyguard's face went pale as he read it, and he stepped close to Dae-hyun, showing him the screen. It was a photo of the bakery, taken from across the street, and the message below it read, "Interesting choice of property to invest in. Your fiancé's father wants to know why you're protecting your ex-wife instead of preparing for your wedding. He's not happy." Dae-hyun's blood ran cold. His future father-in-law, Don Castellano, was watching him, which meant the alliance was in jeopardy, which meant war was coming, and this time he'd brought it right to Jade's door. Dae-hyun stood in the small back room of the bakery, watching his daughter sleep on a worn-out couch that had seen better days. Naomi's chest rose and fell with the peaceful rhythm of childhood. Her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, completely unaware that her father, a man she'd never met, was standing 3 feet away, trying not to fall apart. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the couch. A small desk cluttered with bills and invoices, and a mini refrigerator that hummed loudly in the corner. This was where Jed had been raising his child, in the back room of a struggling bakery, working 18-hour days just to keep the lights on and food on the table. The contrast between this cramped space and his penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and million-dollar view made him sick. He had been living in luxury, surrounded by art and expensive furniture, while his daughter slept on a couch that probably came from a thrift store. Jade stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. She'd aged in the 4 years since he'd seen her, but not in a bad way. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness in her jaw that spoke of struggles and survival. She'd always been beautiful, but now there was something else, a strength, a resilience that made her even more striking. You can't just walk back into our lives and fix everything with money, Jade said quietly, careful not to wake Naomi. I don't need you to rescue me, Dae-hyun. I've been doing fine on my own. The words stung because they were meant to, and because they were a lie they both knew she had to tell to preserve whatever dignity she had left. Dae-hyun turned away from his sleeping daughter to face Jade fully, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them like a physical presence. Fine? You call being 3 months behind on a loan shark's payment fine? You call raising our daughter in the back room of a bakery fine? Jade, those men were going to take everything from you today. They were going to put you and Naomi on the street. How is that fine? His voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm, and Jade's eyes flashed with anger. She stepped closer, her voice low and fierce. At least I was here. At least I didn't abandon her before she was even born. You want to talk about what's fine and what isn't, Ocean. Let's talk about how I showed up at your office building 7 months pregnant. How I begged your security team to let me see you for just 5 minutes, and how they physically escorted me off the property. Let's talk about how I sent you letters, emails, messages through every channel I could think of, and you ignored every single one. Let's talk about how I went into labor alone, gave birth alone, brought our daughter home to an empty apartment alone. So don't you dare stand there in your $1,000 suit and lecture me about what's fine. The words were like acid burning through every justification he built over the. Dae-hyun wanted to tell her that he'd never received those messages, that his people must have filtered them out. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was his fault. He'd given explicit orders to cut Jade out of his life completely, to make sure nothing from her got through to him. He'd been so convinced that distance would keep her safe that he'd built a wall too high to climb. Before Dae-hyun could respond, Taemin appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. We need to go. Now. I just got word that Castellano's men are on their way here. They're not happy about the situation and they're coming in force. Dae-hyun's jaw tightened. Don Castellano was not a man who accepted disrespect and cancelling a wedding 3 weeks out, or even appearing to prioritize something else over it, would be seen as the ultimate insult. The alliance between their families was worth tens of millions in sheer territory and resources, and Castellano's daughter, Isabella, had been preparing for this wedding for months. If Dae-hyun backed out now, or if Castellano even suspected he was having second thoughts, it would mean war. And not just any war, or war that would tear Atlanta's underworld apart and leave hundreds dead. How many men? Dae-hyun asked, his mind already calculating options and strategies. At least a dozen, maybe more. They'll be here in less than 10 minutes. Jade's face had gone pale again. What's happening? Who's coming? Dae-hyun turned to her, and for the first time since walking into the bakery, he let her see the truth in his eyes. The fear, the regret, the desperate need to protect her and Naomi, no matter the cost. I'm supposed to get married in 3 weeks to Don Castellano's daughter. It's a political marriage, an alliance that's supposed to end a territory war that's been going on for 2 years. But now Castellano knows I'm here, knows I paid off your debt, and he thinks I'm choosing you over his daughter. He's coming to remind me what happens to people who break deals with him. The color drained completely from Jade's face as the implications sank in. You need to leave right now. Take your men and go. Tell him it was just business. Tell him you were investing in property. Tell him anything. But you can't be here when he arrives. I won't let Naomi get caught up in your world. But even as she said it, they both knew it was too late. The moment Dae-hyun had stepped into this bakery, the moment he'd paid off her debt, the moment Castellano's men had photographed him here, Jade and Naomi had become part of his world, whether she wanted it or not. And in his world, there was no such thing as innocent bystanders. It's too late for that, Dae-hyun said, pulling out his phone and making a call. Jean, I need you to bring 20 men to Sweet Heaven Bakery on Piedmont Avenue. Full tactical gear. We're about to have company, and I need to make sure it doesn't turn into a bloodbath. Yes, I know what this means. Just get here. He ended the call and looked at Jade. I need you to take Naomi and go into the bathroom, lock the door, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Jade shook her head. This is my bakery, my business. I'm not hiding in the bathroom while you turn it into a war zone. Dae-hyun wanted to argue, wanted to physically carry her and Naomi to safety, but he could see the stubborn set of her jaw and knew he'd lost this battle before it began. She'd survived 4 years without him. She'd built a life, raised a child, fought off loan sharks. She wasn't the same woman he'd sent away, and he couldn't treat her like she was. Outside, the sound of car engines rumbled to a stop in front of the bakery. Dae-hyun moved to the front window and saw 6 black SUVs parked in a semicircle, blocking off the street. Men in dark suits emerged, at least 15 of them, all armed, and stepping out of the center vehicle was Don Castellano himself, a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd built his empire on old-school brutality and shrewd business sense. He wore an expression that Dae-hyun knew well, the look of a man who'd been disrespected and was here to collect payment in blood. Castellano walked toward the bakery's broken entrance with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight in his life. His men flanked him, hands near their weapons, ready for anything. Dae-hyun's own reinforcements were still 5 minutes away, which meant he was outnumbered 3-1. Behind him, he heard Naomi staring on the couch, her small voice calling out for her mother. Jade rushed back to the room, scooping up their daughter, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. But Naomi was looking past her mother, looking at the dangerous men gathering outside, looking at Dae-hyun with those eyes that were so much like his own. And in that moment, Dae-hyun made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to hide who Naomi was. He wasn't going to pretend this was just a business transaction. He was going to tell Castellano the truth, that this was his daughter, that Jade was the mother of his child, and that no alliance, no amount of money, no threat of war would make him walk away from them again. Castellano stepped through the broken doorway, glass crunching under his expensive Italian shoes, and smiled. It was the smile of a shark that had just spotted blood in the water. Kang Dae-hyun, he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. We need to talk about your priorities and about what happens to men who make my daughter look like a Don Castellano surveyed the bakery like a general inspecting conquered territory, his cold eyes taking in every detail. Modest display cases, the flour-dusted counters, the family photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. His gaze lingered on Jade, who stood protectively in front of Naomi, her body language screaming defiance, even as fear flickered across her face. Then Castellano's attention shifted to Dae-hyun, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. You know, I've done business with a lot of men over the years, Castellano said, his voice conversational but laced with menace. Thieves, killers, liars, I've worked with them all. But the one thing I can't tolerate, the one thing that will get a man killed faster than anything else, is disrespect. And right now, Kang, you're disrespecting me, my daughter, and every agreement we've made over the past 6 months. His men fanned out through the small bakery, positioning themselves strategically, turning the cozy shop into a trap. Tae-min and Dae-hyun's other 2 bodyguards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Dae-hyun raised a hand slightly, signaling them to hold. Starting a firefight with his daughter 10 feet away was not an option. Outside, he could hear sirens in the distance, not police, but his own reinforcements, still 3 minutes out. 3 minutes that felt like an eternity. Castellano continued, stepping closer with each word. My Isabella has been planning this wedding for months. She's picked out her dress, sent out invitations to every major family from here to New York, reserved the most expensive venue in the city. And now I'm hearing rumors that you're having second thoughts, that you're here in a bakery playing hero for some woman who means nothing to you. Dae-hyun felt his temper flare at the dismissive way Castellano spoke about Jade, but he kept his voice level and controlled. Jade isn't just some woman, she's the mother of my child, my daughter. He gestured toward Naomi, who was peeking out from behind her mother, with wide, frightened eyes. I didn't know about her until today. I walked in here to order a wedding cake and found out I'm a father. So yes, my priorities have shifted. And I'm not going to apologize for that. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Castellano's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. He walked past Dae-hyun toward Jade and Naomi, and Dae-hyun's entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to put himself between the mob boss and his family. But Castellano simply stopped a few feet away, studying Naomi with the clinical interest of someone evaluating an asset. How old? He asked Jade directly. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the tremor in her voice. 4. She just turned 4 last month. Castellano nodded slowly, doing the same math Dae-hyun had done earlier. So you got pregnant right around the time Kang here was making his first real moves in this city. Interesting timing. Tell me, did you come back into his life now because you heard about a wedding? Because you figured a mafia boss with marriage on his mind might be vulnerable to a sob story about a secret child? The accusation was like gasoline on a fire, and Jade's eyes blazed with fury. I didn't come back into his life at all. Jade shot back, her fear momentarily overridden by righteous anger. He walked into my bakery. I've been raising Naomi on my own for 4 years, working 16-hour days, fighting off loan sharks, barely keeping this place afloat, and I never asked him for a single thing. I didn't even know he was getting married until 5 minutes ago. So don't you dare stand there and accuse me of being some kind of opportunist. I've survived just fine without Kang Dae-hyun, and I'll survive just fine after he leaves, which I'm sure he will. The words were meant to wound Dae-hyun, and they did, cutting deeper than any knife. But they also did something else. The old Castellano, the old mob boss, had spent decades reading people, detecting lies, sniffing out weakness and deception. And Jade's anger was too raw, too genuine to be fake. He turned back to Dae-hyun, and when he spoke, his tone had shifted from threatening to calculating. So you really didn't know? This isn't some play to get out of the marriage, some scheme you cooked up. You're telling me the truth. Dae-hyun met his gaze steadily. I'm telling you the truth. I had no idea Naomi existed until 30 minutes ago. But now that I do, everything's changed. I can't marry Isabella. I can't build an alliance on a lie. These are my people now, and I have to protect them. It was the wrong thing to say, or maybe the right thing said at the wrong time, because Castellano's face hardened into stone. Your people, Castellano repeated, his voice dropping into a register that made Dae-hyun's blood run cold. Let me tell you about your people, Kang. Your people are the men who fought and bled for you over the past 4 years. Your people are the soldiers who followed you into wars, who've taken bullets meant for you, who've built this empire with their own hands and blood. And you're going to throw all of that away, throw away everything we've built together, for a woman you haven't seen in 4 years, and a child you've known for less than an hour. The logic was sound, the arguments compelling, and Dae-hyun could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Everything Castellano said was true. Walking away from this alliance would destabilize everything he'd built, would put hundreds of his people at risk, would likely trigger the exact war the marriage was supposed to prevent. But then, Naomi shifted behind Jade, and Dae-hyun caught a glimpse of her face, terrified, confused, looking at him like he might be a monster. And he realized that he'd spent 4 years becoming exactly that, a monster. A man so focused on power and territory that he'd abandoned the woman he loved and missed his own daughter's birth. He told himself it was necessary, that the ends justified the means, that he was building something bigger than himself. But what was the point of an empire if it cost him his soul? What was the point of power if it meant abandoning the people who actually mattered? I understand what I'm risking, Dae-hyun said quietly, and the certainty in his voice made several of Castellano's men shift uncomfortably. I understand that walking away from this marriage means war. I understand that people will die, that territory will be lost, that everything I've built might come crashing down. But I also understand that I've already lost 4 years of my daughter's life because I was too blind and too stupid to see what actually mattered. I'm not losing another day. So here's my offer, Don Castellano. I'll pay you $10 million in compensation for the disrespect to your daughter and your family. I'll cede you the territory we were supposed to share, the port access, the warehouses, all of it. You'll come out of this richer and more powerful than you would have been with the marriage alliance. All I ask is that you walk away from here peacefully and leave my family alone. The offer was beyond generous, bordering on insane. Dae-hyun was essentially giving away half his empire for a woman and a child he barely knew. Behind him, he could hear Taemin's sharp intake of breath, could feel the shock radiating from his own men. But Castellano didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a promising student throw away a bright future. You're making a mistake, Kang. A mistake that's going to cost you everything. But I'll accept your offer. One condition. He pulled out his phone and made a brief call, then turned back to Dae-hyun with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My daughter Isabella is on her way here. She deserves to hear this from you directly, to your face. You're going to look her in the eye and tell her You're choosing another woman over her. And if you can do that, if you can break her heart to her face, then we have a deal. Before Dae-hyun could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air outside, and through the broken door, he saw a sleek white Mercedes pull up. Isabel Castellano emerged, stunning in a designer dress, her dark hair perfect, her makeup flawless. She was everything a Mafia wife should be: beautiful, poised, dangerous. And the look on her face when she saw Dae-hyun standing in the bakery next to Jade and Naomi was pure murder. Isabella Castellano walked through the broken glass entrance like she owned the world, her designer heels clicking against the floor with sharp, deliberate precision. She was breathtaking in the way that dangerous things often are: perfectly styled, perfectly controlled, perfectly furious. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept across the bakery, taking in every detail with the same calculating assessment her father had just performed. But when her gaze landed on Naomi, something flickered across her face that Dae-hyun couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or jealousy or even surprise. It was something softer, something almost like recognition or understanding, and it vanished so quickly he thought he might have imagined it. "So this is her," Isabella said, her voice smooth and cultured, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of expensive boarding schools and European finishing classes. "The great love that's worth destroying an empire for. I have to say, Dae-hyun, I expected someone more impressive. A bakery owner struggling with loan sharks. Really? That's what you're throwing away our future for?" The words were meant to hurt Jade, and they did. Dae-hyun saw her flinch, saw the way her arms tightened around Naomi protectively. But Jade didn't back down, didn't look away from Isabella's withering stare. "I didn't ask for any of this," Jade said firmly, her voice steady despite the obvious fear coursing through her. "I didn't ask him to come here, didn't ask him to pay off my debt, didn't ask him to blow up his life for me and Naomi. So if you want to be angry at someone, be angry at him. But don't you dare look at my daughter like she's some kind of inconvenience to your wedding plans." The defiance in Jade's voice seemed to surprise Isabella, and for a moment, the two women stared at each other across the small bakery, two completely different worlds colliding in the most unexpected way. Isabella turned her attention to Dae-hyun, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. "Do you love her?" she asked bluntly, gesturing toward Jade. "Is this about love or is it about... Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making a catastrophically stupid decision based on 4-year-old feelings and a child you just met. You and I both know this marriage was never about love. It was about power, about territory, about building something bigger than either of us alone. And you were fine with that arrangement until 30 minutes ago. So tell me the truth, Dae-hyun, what's really going on here?" The question was fair, brutally fair, and Dae-hyun had to take a moment to consider his answer carefully. Did he still love Jade? He'd spent 4 years convincing himself that cutting her out had been the right choice, that the feelings he'd had for her were just a weakness he needed to overcome. But standing here now, seeing the woman she'd become, seeing the daughter they'd created together, he realized that he'd never stopped loving her. He'd just buried it deep enough that he could function, could build his empire without the constant ache of her absence. "I love her," Dae-hyun said quietly, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. "I never stopped loving her. I just convinced myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. But I was wrong. And yes, this is also about guilt, about missing 4 years of my daughter's life, about realizing that everything I built means nothing if I build it on the graves of the people who actually matter to me. He turned to look at Jade, who was staring at him with tears streaming down her face, her expression a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. Isabel laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness and something that might have been pain. You know what the funny thing is? I actually respect you for this. Most men in your position would have lied, would have found a way to keep both the empire and the girl. They would have married me for the alliance and kept her as a secret on the side, visited their daughter on weekends, lived 2 lives, and thought they were being clever about it. But you're actually willing to throw it all away, to walk away from everything we could have built together, because you think it's the right thing to do. It's noble. It's also incredibly stupid, but it's noble. She walked closer to Dae-hyun, and her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear. My father is going to destroy you for this. You know that, right? He'll accept your money, take your territory, smile and shake your hand, and then he'll spend the next 5 years systematically dismantling everything you've built. He'll turn your allies against you, cut off your supply lines, target your businesses one by one. And when you're finally broken and desperate, when you've lost everything and everyone, he will make sure you know it was because he chose a bakery owner and a kid over his daughter. Is she really worth that? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Dae-hyun looked at Isabella, saw the genuine concern in her eyes beneath all the anger and wounded pride, and realized that in another life they might have actually made a good team. She was smart, ruthless, strategic, everything a partner in his world needed to be. But she wasn't Jade, and no amount of strategic advantage could change that fundamental truth. Yes, Dae-hyun said simply, she's worth it. They're both worth it. Isabella nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer, but hoped she might be wrong. She turned to her father, who'd been watching this entire exchange with the patient interest of a man who knew he'd already won. Papa, I want to make a counter-offer. Castellano's eyebrows rose slightly. Isabella, this isn't Hamisho. I want to make a counter-offer, she repeated, her voice firm and unyielding. She'd clearly inherited her father's steel spine and stubborn will. Kang keeps his territory. All of it. The port access, the warehouses, everything we were supposed to share. He pays us 5 million instead of 10 as a gesture of respect and compensation for my public embarrassment. And in exchange, we get something more valuable than territory or money. She paused, letting the tension build, and Dae-hyun felt his stomach drop because he couldn't imagine what she was about to propose. We get first refusal on any future alliances. When Kang eventually needs help. And he will, because choosing love over strategy means he's going to make enemies. We get first choice on whether to support him or let him burn. We become the power that decides whether his little family experiment succeeds or fails. That way, we maintain influence without the messy complications of a marriage neither of us wanted in the first place. The proposal was brilliant, diabolical, and absolutely characteristic of a Castellano. It gave them power without requiring them to actually do anything, kept Dae-hyun in their orbit while seeming to let him go, and positioned them as kingmakers in whatever conflicts inevitably arose from this decision. Don Castellano studied his daughter with something that might have been pride or might have been calculation. With him, it was always hard to tell the difference. You've been paying attention, he said approvingly. Then he turned to Dae-hyun. My daughter's offer is more than generous, considering you're essentially jilting her 3 weeks before the wedding. Do you accept? Dae-hyun wanted to refuse, wanted to tell them both to go to hell, and that he didn't need anyone's permission or approval to live his life. But he wasn't stupid, and he wasn't so blinded by emotion that he couldn't see the lifeline Isabella was throwing him. Her proposal gave him a way out that didn't end in immediate war, that protected Jade and Naomi from becoming targets, that preserved at least some of his power and influence. It came with strings attached, heavy binding strings that would tie him to the Castellano family for years to come. But it was better than the alternative. "I accept," Dae-hyun said, and felt the weight of that acceptance settle onto his shoulders like chains made of gold. Isabella smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, though whether it was genuine warmth or satisfaction at outmaneuvering everyone in the room was impossible to say. "Then we have a deal. Papa, have your lawyers draw the papers. I want everything formalized by tomorrow evening." She walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back at Jade, who'd been silent through this entire negotiation, just watching and holding Naomi close. "Take care of him," Isabella said, and her voice had lost all its earlier venom, replaced by something that sounded almost like sympathy. "He's choosing you over an empire, which means you're either the luckiest woman alive or the most cursed. Time will tell which." Then she was gone, stepping back into her Mercedes and disappearing into Atlanta traffic, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the echo of heels on broken glass. Castellano lingered a moment longer, his eyes moving between Dae-hyun, Jade, and little Naomi. When he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier menace, replaced by something that might have been genuine advice from one father to another. "You're making a choice that a lot of men in our world never have the courage to make, Kang. You're choosing family over power. I respect that, even as I think you're going to regret it. But let me give you some wisdom I learned the hard way. If you're going to sacrifice everything for these two, then you better make damn sure it's worth it. Don't let guilt or sentimentality turn into resentment 5 years from now when your empire is half the size and your enemies are circling. Make it count." Then he too was gone, his men filing out behind him, leaving Dae-hyun alone in the bakery with Jade, Naomi, and the bodyguards who looked like they just witnessed their boss commit professional suicide. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Dae-hyun's reinforcements were finally arriving, 20 men in tactical gear pulling up to find the crisis already over, the danger already past. Taemin dismissed them with a brief phone call, and then it was just the 3 of them. Dae-hyun, Jed, and the daughter he'd only known existed for less than an hour. Naomi had stopped crying, but she was watching him with those eyes that were so much like his own, trying to understand who the stranger was and why her mother was looking at him like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. "So," Jade said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens now?" It was the question that would determine everything, the question that would shape the rest of their lives. And Dae-hyun realized he didn't have a prepared answer. He didn't have a strategic plan or a calculated response. For the first time in 4 years, he was going to have to figure things out as he went, without the safety net of power and control. "Now," Dae-hyun said, kneeling down so he was at Naomi's eye level, "I'd like to meet my daughter properly, if that's okay with you." Naomi looked at her mother, who nodded through her tears, and then she looked back at Dae-hyun with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could muster. "Mommy says my daddy left before I was born," she said in that blunt, honest way children have. "Are you my—" The question cracked something open in Dae-hyun's chest. something he'd kept locked away for so long, he'd forgotten it existed. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm your daddy, and I'm so sorry I wasn't here before. But I'm here now, and I'm never leaving again." Naomi considered this for a long moment, her small face scrunched up in concentration. Then she held out her stuffed rabbit, the one with the missing ear. "This is Mr. Hoppy. He's been sad because he doesn't have a daddy either. Can you be his daddy too?" Dae-hyun took the one stuffed animal with hands that had signed death warrants and negotiated million-dollar deals, and he held it like it was made of glass. "I would be honored to be Hoppy's daddy," he said, and Naomi smiled for the first time. A smile so bright and pure. It made every sacrifice, every loss, every bit of territory and power he'd just given up feel worth it. Jade was crying openly now, and when Dae-hyun stood up, she walked into his arms like she'd never left, like the 4 years apart had been just a bad dream they were finally waking up from. "You were an idiot," she whispered against his. "You just gave up everything for us. What if we can't make this work? What if Naomi resents you for not being there? What if I can't forgive you for leaving in the first place? Then we'll figure it out together," Dae-hyun said, holding her and his daughter, feeling more complete than he had in 4 years, despite having just lost half his empire. "We'll figure it out together." And as the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Korean Mafia boss, who would come to buy a wedding cake, walked out of Sweet Heaven Bakery not with a symbol of a strategic alliance, but with something infinitely more valuable, a family he didn't deserve but would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. 6 months later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Dae-hyun stood in that same bakery, which he'd helped Jade expand into 3 locations across the city. Naomi sat at a small table in the corner doing her homework and occasionally feeding bits of muffin to Mr. Hoppy. Jade was behind the counter, laughing with the customer, her face free of the stress and fear that had marked it when he'd first walked back into her life. The Castellanos had kept their word. The alliance was dissolved, but they'd left Dae-hyun's remaining territory alone. He was smaller now, less powerful, less feared. But he was there when Naomi woke up from nightmares. There for her first day of kindergarten, there to teach her how to ride a bike and to read her bedtime stories. And as he watched his daughter look up and wave at him, her smile bright and trusting, Kang Dae-hyun knew he'd made the right choice. Some empires were built on blood and fear, but the one that mattered most was built on love. And that was the one worth fighting for. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional journeys. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you give up everything for a second chance at family? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.